I am Paul Zelensky, your facilitator for this conversation. Today, we're going to talk about the role lawyers play in creating a world that is civil, professional, and multiculturally competent. With us today are two esteemed colleagues, Assistant Dean and Professor Mable Martin-Scott and Professor Kimberly O'Leary. The bios of these two impressive people will be posted in the chat. Now, this is a conversation implying your participation. We encourage you to ask questions by posting them in the chat while our guest makes some opening comments. We'll be recording today's program if you didn't already hear that. And if you're not speaking, please mute your audio. So let's get the conversation started. Professors Martin-Scott and O'Leary, you co-teach a multicultural lawyering class. How did the idea for the class come about?
I will take that.
Okay.
Professor O'Leary, Kim came to me about a year ago and talked about the possibility of teaching this course. And it's interesting because students will actually ask me, you know, Professor Martin-Scott, it's just really great that you've decided to come up with this multicultural lawyering course. And it really was not my idea. It was Professor O'Leary's idea. And she contacted me and she said, Mabel, I think this would be fantastic for us. And so I was somewhat not sure, but when I heard her talk about it and we talked about the material we would use, and we taught the course for the first time in Hillary of this year, it was just amazing. And it absolutely amazing. And I'll let Kim basically kick in terms of why she thought this was a good idea.
Thanks, Mabel. Yeah, I'm grateful every day that Mabel said, yes, I'll go in with you on this project, because it really is, if you're going to model multicultural understanding, some of the time you have to be in it as a joint venture, I think, and really both people in there, you know, with a full heart and full hands, and it's been that and more as we started. So what prompted me? Well, I've been teaching for over 30 years. And most of my career I've taught in law school clinics. So I'm teaching students to represent clients. And in the former two law schools where I taught, I was teaching mostly middle class, upper middle class white students to represent poor clients of color in legal services setting. And so I had to develop a whole set of material to help those students understand that their experience of the world wasn't the only experience of the world, and that the professional thing to do is your job as a lawyer is to represent the interests of clients. And if you don't understand your client's interests, you can't do that. And so I developed all these materials, and then I came to Cooley, where we have a student body that is so multicultural that I kind of had to, you know, pretty much ditch most of that in the clinic, because the students just talking to each other and being in school with each other for a couple of years had those skills. Then I went back into the first year to teach contracts and property, went overseas a couple of times with a foreign study program. And what I was noticing, what really hit me like a ton of bricks in the first year curriculum, is that all of the cases, very few of them involve disputes between ordinary people, which makes sense, because ordinary people can't afford to appeal cases. So all of the cases that students are reading are factually situations that most of our students have never experienced. And so this was bothering me, right? This idea, because it just reinforced this idea that our students don't belong in this profession. You know, when I was a lawyer, I was admitted to the bar in 1982. I went to work in Southern Indiana. There were two women in the county I practiced. The other one was my mother. And I remember saying to my mother, what's the dress code for female lawyers in Gibson County? And she said, whatever we want it to be, you know, and it'll probably be wrong, because everything we do is wrong. But, you know, but at least we get to decide that. And so I understand what it feels like to be in a profession that makes it seem as if you don't belong. And I wanted our students not just to know they belong, but to know that their voice is important. So that gets to the honor part. You know, our legal profession is not going to be very professional if we don't have judges and lawyers who are able to understand the different cultural goals and needs of the clients, the people that come through the system. And there's sort of disturbing evidence that a lot of ordinary people don't trust the legal system. You may have read a few articles lately. Right? So that's a problem in a democracy. You know, our system involves people believing that it works, and they're only going to believe it works if people give them reason to believe it works. So, you know, judges do a lot of diversity training and that sort of thing. But so let me just I'll say one more thing, and then I'll leave it to Paul to rein me in. When I conceived of the course, I think it might be, I mean, I don't think there are very many courses like this. The book publisher said, what kind of course is this? Well, it's part professional identity, what you might have in, you know, Amy and Erica and Mabel's department, right? PPR kind of idea. It's part skills. We have 3 weeks where we just have them do simulations of representing clients who come from a different background. It's part policy. So we have guest speakers coming in. We've had guest speakers from all around the world, from people that'll read a law review article, and the woman who authored it, she'll come and speak to them, talk about what happens in the law when people get it wrong. Some horrible situations. And so the students learn about that. And then their project, instead of a scholarly writing, it's a seminar. They don't do a research paper. What they do is they have to interview an ordinary person. And my rule is the person can't be a lawyer, they can't be a judge, they can't be a law clerk, they can't have anything to do with the legal system. And they interview this person and report back to the class this person's views about the legal system. So our students came up with the questions as a group. And the presentations were just unbelievable. Our students come from the most interesting backgrounds. And so a lot of them interviewed family members and friends, and they were just fascinating. So that's the course sort of in a nutshell, and that's why. But I think it's a professional obligation in today's society that we learn how to hear each other, backgrounds and goals, and instead of just talking over each other, which we're really good at, to actually listen a little more.
Do you find a point in the class where there's kind of a switch with the students when they become more other focused? You know, so it's not necessarily about from their point of view; it's from others' point of view. And how does that? What does that look like if that does in fact happen?
It looks amazing because so often we look at life through our lens, and this course is absolutely awesome in terms of having students actually listen, because I personally believe that everything as it deals with race and all of the differences that we believe we have when we're so much alike has to do with not listening, because there's this fear of being different, and you know, that person is different and I don't want to engage with that person. But when you can give people an opportunity to really sit down and listen to someone who's different from them, I think it's just, and it happens all the time, you realize how very much alike you really are. And so what we have is I thought Kim had stacked the deck when we looked at our students that had signed up for our multicultural class, because the diversity was just amazing. But that's, of course, Cooley. We had students who were from Cuba, we had Hispanic students, we had Black students, we had students who were from Southern Indiana who had lived in towns where they didn't see people of different color, and just sitting there and having them talk to each other and look at each other, you could see those light bulbs going off in the class. And the class was absolutely amazing because they would say things like, I didn't know that. You know, I wish I'd known that. I can look at this, I see this a little bit different now. And so it's kind of like, for me, I hadn't thought about teaching this class and just constantly teaching. For the last 20 years, I've taught contracts here, and you see those light bulbs going off when a student gets a concept, and it's just so rewarding. Well, those light bulbs were going off in this multicultural learning class, and the students were just embracing it. You know, and I wasn't sure if they would or would not, but I figured since I was the assistant dean and the disciplinarian person, they'd be scared to really act out too much. But I was pleasantly surprised that they just embraced that and they welcomed the conversation.
Was there a moment
Yeah.
in the class when because the curriculum for this particular course is not necessarily prevalent across legal education today, and we're at a point where for a particular student you just saw a transformation that occurred, like they took the lens off and then turned them around and looked the other way. I mean, if you know what I'm saying, that they're looking at the world differently, perhaps based on some of the things that are going on in the class.
The design of the course takes them through an intentional turning and looking at certain things. So at the beginning, we look at the ABA reports on bias in the legal profession. They watch an ABA video on that, and we had a judge come and speak. And she herself, African-American judge from Mississippi, who happened to be Mabel's roommate in law school. And then we've turned them in on lawyer identity. So they read articles about when lawyers represent clients who are like them, or when they represent clients who are different from them, what kind of identity issues does that present? So they're very much turning inward on themselves there. But then we do this 3-week client unit, and I think, to me, that's when the eyes really start. Well, that and the implicit bias. They do an implicit bias, and I think a lot of our students of color are surprised that they may have implicit biases, right? And so that surprises them, and we talk that out, and then we do this client unit where they're doing these client simulations, and that's when I really start to see the reflections. They have to do a reflection every week, and the reflections are coming in with, I never thought about, from their point of view, because they play the client for one half of the thing, and then they play the lawyer for the other. So they actually have to experience what it's like to be the client with a certain set of parameters. And that really opens their eyes to, oh, I felt like sort of marginalized, when this person did this to me, kind of thing. So, yeah, it's, you definitely saw, growth from week to week, and them sort of gelling. But I think going along with each other in the journey, not so much an individual as the group.
Common experience. We're happy to have with us today our President and Dean, James McGrath, who would like to say a couple words as we move along here today.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I just wanted to tell everybody that both Mabel and Kim are just such great colleagues. I'm glad they're doing this. They're always at everything and have great comments and great help with whatever we're doing, and it's just really exciting, this class that you're doing. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to say, I was listening to Kim, you talking about your clinical experience, and my clinical experience in the law came from when I was a student, and I worked in a health law clinic, and a lot of people didn't know that they had the right to get some health care in some way because they didn't understand. And during this time, the system. And during this time, I read this book, and I just going to throw it out there because it is one of the best books ever that talks about these issues where people are not getting the services they need because of cultural barriers. And it's called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. It's by a woman named Ann Fadiman. And it's about this family of refugees from their Hmong from Southeast Asia. And they can barely find anyone to translate for them. And they go through some horrible healthcare issues. And The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down refers to someone having a seizure and fainting. And it took a long time to get that out. And the way they perceived health and medicine was very different than the way the healthcare professionals in this country did. And it unfortunately almost killed the woman because they couldn't get on the same page with things. And so I really applaud what you're doing because it's so very important. Not just in the law, of course, but the law is the most important thing, but in medicine, in everything. And I appreciate you're making us all much more culturally sensitive. Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in for a second, President McGrath, I want to thank you, and we want to thank you for introducing the law school to the implicit bias in terms of, and that was eye-opening, not just, it certainly was to me, in terms of how we're looking at it. I figured there's no bias. I'm just really, I get this. And you really have to, it's possibly, usually those people who really get it are the ones who really don't. And so it was very eye-opening, and I think an excellent introduction to your faculty to actually provide that particular training to us. Thank you again for that. We actually do quite a bit of that in class.
Build on that.
So
if I could build on that for a second, you know, when we take that in the class, and I always take the Harvard project has multiple implicit bias tests you can take, so I always take a couple of new ones. But I tell my students, you know, I was the director of 60 Plus. I have been doing research on elder law and ethics. I've been giving presentations, you know, to the ABA and to Michigan lawyers and to legal services professionals. This is just a way of saying that, you know, I felt I had no age bias, right? I'm writing articles on independence planning and all this, and I take the age implicit bias test, and it shows that I'm biased against older people, right? And you know what I say to my students? We live in a culture that idolizes youth. It's on TV. I've grown up with it my whole life. I'm not supposed to have gray hair. I'm supposed to look a certain way, right? And we all supposed to want to be younger. And so what would be shocking is if I didn't have that bias, right? It's not what's going on in the reasoning part of my brain. It's what's going on in the subconscious part of my brain that's working against me. And so the important thing is just to realize it and put that out on the table. Okay, now we can move forward, recognizing that we have this. So, you know, I do think it's eye-opening to think about what is it in our main sort of predominant culture that's giving us all kinds of messages about how the world is supposed to work. And then think about your poor client who walks into a courtroom and all of the messages that courtroom is giving that person about how the world is supposed to work, and they don't feel like they belong there. So, yeah.
Thanks for that. You know, for those of you who are not familiar with WMU Cooley, I know that we have some folks that are not part of our community. Early last year, upon President McGrath's arrival here at the law school, we embarked on a comprehensive implicit bias training, a beginning, and all of our faculty and staff and our students. And now we've incorporated that into our onboarding for our new students every semester, and then there'll be more things coming. So those of you who don't know what we're necessarily referring to, just want to give you some context. I want to go back to something you two said earlier about people not trusting the legal system. Let's talk about that a little bit. Is the core issue different, or is it something about the structure of the system that is just flawed, or both? Or what are your thoughts about why people don't trust the system?
I'll start with that. That's the reason I went to law school. In terms of I comment all the time. I grew up in the inner city of Chicago, and I was just in the thick of poverty in terms of those around us, discrimination. It was lack of hope, lack of opportunity. And I can't remember when being a lawyer was not something that I was just destined to do. And part of that's what I decided to do, because I just simply felt that people shouldn't have to live this way. And I saw that. And so I decided to go to law school. I don't think I am the bulb. I don't think I'm any brighter than anyone else, but growing up and seeing how people are treated very differently, you then want to now have an impact on that. And so going to law school did that. I don't think it's, it's where so often people will say, well, I really don't see a problem. I said, well, you really aren't looking in terms of that. And so there is, what we saw in terms of this multicultural lawyering class that Kim and I taught was how many interviews came in when just person after person after person was saying, the system just doesn't work, and they felt that way. These were ordinary people. Again, we weren't talking to attorneys, but the system, if you are involved in it, it depends on, as I said, it depends on your lens that you're looking at the system in. And I absolutely went to law school because it clearly was biased to me, which is the thing that brought me to Cooley as well. I'll let Kim.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I would say is I think when we don't have full representation, especially of people who don't have means, then they don't have an opportunity to tell their side. in a way that is, to use a fancy word we would use in law school, cognizable by the legal system, right? Recognized as a thing that a judge could take into account. And let me just give you a really a quick example. I was a clinic supervisor in a law school in Indianapolis. We were doing a landlord-tenant case, but we happened to have an elderly client. So, as is totally unusual for my career, we were representing the landlord. And before we went up to it was a small claims hearing, and Mabel remembered small claims judges didn't even have to be lawyers in Indianapolis at that time. And we had talked to the tenant beforehand, and the tenant had some problems with some conditions in the property, which would be a defense to non-payment of rent. But we represented the landlord, remember? And so, in Indiana, you could have a lawyer represent you in small claims court. And so we went up with our client. They didn't have a lawyer. The judge looked at the unrepresented tenants and said, I understand they're alleging you didn't pay rent. Did you pay the rent? And he said no. And the court said, okay, judgment in favor of the landlord, you have to be out in 10 days. And I said to my student after that hearing that I was worried. I was worried for the safety of our landlord client because I knew that these guys who were angry didn't have a chance to tell the judge anything about their grievance. And the next morning, my student got a phone call, and the guys had put beer cans all over her car during the night. This was how they acted out on this, and I thought, well, thank goodness it's just beer cans on your car. That's, at least she's safe. But I knew in my gut, and that's why people don't trust the legal system, because they had a grievance, they had a story, and it wasn't my job to tell it. But yet I knew how they would feel just being sort of pushed through the system in that way. And that happens over and over and over again. Training lawyers to listen, training lawyers who will be judges to ask the right questions will help.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask what I would perceive to be a really hard question. And this is not just meant for Professors Martin-Scott and O'Leary, and if anybody has an opinion on that. So what's the journey then? So you're training these lawyers, these law students to become lawyers that are multiculturally competent. And I think that's the ultimate outcome for taking a class and being in a diverse environment like the law school that we do have. Through a legal system that ends in a criminal justice system that ends up in the disproportionate death of people of color at the hands of law enforcement. What's that journey? I mean, how did we get there? I mean, is it just, should we just label it racism, period, end of story? Or how does, from the parties that are involved, from the police officers to the victims to the system, how do we bridge from teaching it or trying to get people to be more aware of and be more multiculturally competent to a society that right now is reeling from what we see almost weekly, if not daily, occurring in cities and towns across our country? Any thoughts on that?
I could give you just one piece of it, because obviously this is a multi-factor thing, right? But I was a history major in college. Our legal system has always had one system for African Americans and one system for white people. And in some parts of our country, it was true if you were Irish, it was true if you were Italian. It just depends on the era. If you were Chinese, certainly, or Japanese. A former judge whose last name is Higginbotham wrote a series of articles on slavery laws in Virginia during the slavery period, and it really is eye-opening to go in and read the laws. I mean, these are things that were written into our statutes. So this is part of our DNA as lawyers. Unlike South Africa, unlike I think some of the Aboriginal country, in Australia and New Zealand, we've never had truth and reconciliation. We've never had any moment in our history where we've actually acknowledged this and made an effort to really strip it down to the basics and say we kind of need to start over, with a lot of this stuff. But so that's just one piece of it. We do ask our students when they give their presentations at the end to have some suggestions and some reform recommendations, because it isn't enough to just say people don't believe the system works. You have to say, well, what can we do about it? And we had some interesting, recommendations from our students, who some of whom will become prosecutors and judges and policymakers and legislators in the future. So that's just one piece.
Do you recall any of what what students suggested?
We have one student. He's actually originally from India, and he was an engineer. He came to the U.S. This is such a Cooley story, right? He was in the military. He got U.S. citizenship. But because he's an engineer, his solution was that legislators should do computer simulations of policy before they enact a law. So does it have an effect that isn't, that we wouldn't expect to see? Does it have a discriminatory effect? And so to run these computer simulations, I thought that was a very good idea. But it's not without cost, right? There's always upsides, but that was one. I don't know, Mabel might remember some of the other, examples, because we did have suggestions from various students.
Yeah, and one of the things in terms of me answering in your question, Paul, is you comment on the journey, and that's what it is, and it doesn't end. It starts when we're born, and it doesn't end. And so what I feel should come from what we're doing in this class is helping students to know that that's our job. We are attorneys of bridges. We are the people that now help other people. Because I remember in law school and having a professor once who said, we're social engineers, and it's our job to make sure that people understand. And what I love about that is I come from the inner city, as I said, of Chicago, where professionalism wasn't something you looked at. But knowing I had to go to law school, you now have to be professional. So what it forces you to do as an attorney, professionalism, we're teaching them, is not an option. It's how you have to engage with other people. So what we do, and I give them examples. I practiced law in Southern Indiana, and there were two other minorities, and I was the only Black person who was practicing law in the Evansville, Indiana type area, in the same place Kim was doing it. I didn't know her. I didn't meet Kim until I came to Cooley. And I remember I ran for prosecutor and barely lost, saved that county significantly in terms of me doing that. But I ran for prosecutor, and I engaged, and many of the attorneys would come up and they would talk. I remember having an attorney coming up and saying to me, you are so articulate. I said, oh, and so are you. I am so pleased to meet you. Oh, how wonderful. And I could just see the shock look on his face, was like, what? And it's a professional way of helping people to understand what they're saying and how you can engage. And I think that's our job. And part of helping your question, Paul, is it just racism? I think it's just difference. And it's so, and the thing that's hard, I think, that comes with this class is how do you talk about the hard questions and the hard topics? And so you listen and you offer an honest opinion. And I could see students at times who would say things, and other students were like, that's not true. But it's not where you're attacking someone. The nature of what we do is we are attorneys, and we now have facts, and we now analyze the facts, and we process stuff. And so it's really beautiful seeing that when we force our students, and we really don't force them, when we put them in an environment where they are really thinking about what they're doing and they're listening.
Let's I don't want to say switch the conversation a little bit, but let's talk about civility. And as part of the equation, that was part of the introduction here today, civility, professionalism, and being multiculturally competent. Not that these by no means are mutually exclusive concepts or ideas. We see today what's going on in Portland, where we have the federal government coming in and putting troops on the ground there, and the government, part of the government, the mayor, the governor, saying go away, and you see people being arrested, not necessarily based on race or gender or anything related to that, and put into unmarked vans and taken away. what's going on in Portland right now? If you've been following, I don't know if you've been following, or anybody that's in the conversation today. How are we characterizing societally what's going on in Portland? There's this pushback. Any thoughts about that in terms of civility?
Oh, it's so beyond the issue of civility and into, well, I'm reluctant to characterize it because I'm so flippin' freaked out by it. But all I keep telling myself is that there is a role for lawyers in this, and they are the only ones who can address this issue and fix it. But I mean, if you want to talk it in terms of civility, I guess I would just say it's a little uncivil.
But lack of civility, is that a tactic to change societal norms?
So Paul, I'm also reluctant to dive into Portland, in part because I'm not there. Although I do have a law professor friend who does live in Portland and whose 17-year-old daughter has been a journalist with a press pass, going down every night.
Wow.
And her 17-year-old daughter and herself got tear gassed the other night. So whatever's going on, they're talking about the wall of moms and the dad with the leaf blowers. You know, it's like Portland is showing up to say we're protesting peacefully. And I don't know, because I'm not there. I do have a kind of a story about civility that has to do with, I think, a failure to understand each other, which I'm not sure is what's going on in Portland, but if you'll indulge me.
Sure.
When I was in New Zealand, I wanted to understand some things about elder law among Maori people. Maori are the indigenous population of New Zealand. And so I got a couple of names of people on the faculty, and I went and I talked to them. And for each instance, they would start by saying, well, what is I think I even got emails first. What is the purpose of this meeting? And I thought, well, that's a strange thing to ask. I just want to talk, right? And so about the third one of these conversations I had, this very patient man, probably about my age, a Maori elder, starts explaining some things about Maori culture. And one of the things he explains is that whenever you have a meeting with somebody you don't know, the first thing you do is you tell them geographically where you're from. The second thing you do is you tell them what people you come from. And the third thing you do is you tell them the purpose of the meeting. And this goes back 1,000 years. I mean, Maori people have been doing this for 1,000 years, literally because when they would encounter another tribe, they didn't know if they were going to kill them or if they were friends. So the purpose of the meeting portion was really important. But this has come into the 21st century as a polite, respectful, civil way to begin a conversation. And so I looked at him and I said, oh, so I guess I was pretty rude. And he just smiled, because he wasn't going to say yes. But I didn't know that until he explained it. So that's an example of me being rude and uncivil, but without knowing it, because I didn't understand the custom. I didn't understand the practice. And as a white British, descended person in a foreign country, I didn't find out, first, because I'm used to not having to do that, I think. And so I think we see that played over and over and over in our society. We have people, an African-American friend of mine had once had somebody in a professional setting wag his finger in her face. And she came down to my office almost in tears. And she said to me, in my culture, that is an invitation to a fight. That is, he's going to hit me, so I'm going to hit him first. And she said, all I could do was say to myself, I don't want to get fired. And so I turned around and I went downstairs to see you. That's a cultural misunderstanding, right? She didn't think he was doing it on purpose, but it didn't matter because it raised, these cultural ways of interacting that for her was extremely uncivil. So when we talk about what civil behavior is, part of the answer is we need to understand each other better. And we need to stop making assumptions about you're not being civil because you wore a certain thing or because you spoke with a certain tone or because, right? I mean, go down the list of assumptions we make about what it means to be civil without asking. Let's talk about this, right?
And that's the role that culture plays in sort of I don't want to say the definition of civility, but the meaning of civility. I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We want to encourage folks to ask. I can keep asking questions unless you don't have any, but this is cool. I wanted to talk about and we didn't talk about this in our pre-meeting, so I apologize for this. I wanted to talk a little bit about the role that power and power shift play in the concept of race relations, being multiculturally competent as people struggle for power. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. When I go back, I don't want to keep going back to Portland, but it's really kind of like, well, the federal government's going to step in and people are just going to fall in line, power. And then you've got civilians saying, oh, no, you're not, struggling for position and power. And then I think we would characterize an event like Portland as being unprofessional, but that's not necessarily kind of in the array of thoughts at this point in that situation. But any thoughts? I don't know, do you talk about it in your class about power shifting and even just the demographic shifts that are going on in the U.S. Based on race and ethnicity? And there's a shift, with perceived loss of power, perceived gain of power, those kinds of things. Any thoughts?
I mean, I don't know that. I definitely don't see a shift. I see engaging in terms of I comment to I dropped my daughter off. I think it's telling my daughter off on Wednesday of last week in Chicago. She's starting medical school there next week, and so she lives right down by Buckingham Fountain, and so I dropped her off and we were going to go out and grab something to eat and come back. And so there were protesters that were around the Grant Park, and they were blocking off Lakeshore Drive. Anybody in Chicago know Lakeshore Drive is. And so they were literally blocking the street. They were blocking the street and they were blocking the interstate. And they were attempting they, I guess, had put a rope around this huge statue of Grant, and they were trying to pull it down, and they sprayed it, and and I'm driving with my daughter in the midst of this, and she has two of her friends that were classmates of hers in college, and my daughter, of course, African American, her two friends are white, and they were sitting there looking at that, and so my daughter's staring, and one of the young ladies said, they're destroying our history. This is that statue's been there. I can remember when I grew up in Evanston, and I can remember that statue being there forever. And these people are just absolutely out of control. And so I was just kind of waiting to see what my daughter said. She didn't. There was not a comment. And the other young lady basically said, well, no, this is, and it was just so interesting, that dialogue, because I think what's going on is people feel there's some discussion, and I think people are rushing into action, and there are different responses to that. And even being the assistant dean here at Cooley, and students call in because, of course, everybody's quarantined and or have too many people that they have to engage in, and it's affecting us so differently. Some people are saying this is just horrible. They're destroying our country, and others are saying great, this stuff is coming down, we finally have. And so the idea, though, is we've got to talk, and Kim, what I think the beauty of the class that we have is just reflective of our nation and our world. We are so different now. We live in a world that is extremely diverse, and we have to have those conversations. And I think, and clearly, if we have those conversations, you will see that people can possibly get to a different place. And some people aren't interested in getting into a different place. They want to get in their side of the ring and just kind of stay there.
Yeah.
But if we are going to survive as a country, we've got to have those very difficult conversations. And I think Portland is basically where there is the essence of the objective is to not be civil. And I think that's exactly what's going on there, and they are successful at it. The mayor of Chicago, I don't know if people heard, came on and said that these guys were coming to Chicago, and she said that's not okay. I don't know how you stop that, but they can, it's just, I think, an attempt to try to control people. And you see that some of this is out of control, and others is, well, what do you do? And I think it's just frustration that's built up.
Right.
Yeah, I also think people will take to the streets if they don't think they can be heard any other way. And we like to talk about Dr. King as an example of professional behavior, but Dr. King and the people who went with him crossed a bridge unlawfully and were beaten. It was a riot. They didn't do violent things, but violent things were done to them. So they did that because they didn't think anybody would listen any other way. I mean, he went to jail because he didn't think anybody would listen any other way. And then he wrote letters from jail that people read because it was the only way people would pay attention. So, I think in a democracy, our institutions are only as strong as we give them legitimacy. And if we don't think they're legitimate, they're not going to be very strong.
Right.
It's frightening to me.
And we're reminded that with the passing of Representative John Lewis this past week, and hearing some of his speeches and commentary too about getting in the way, is important part of the process. To your point, Kim, I want to give you an opportunity to make some final comments. When you thought about the class, and the two of you ultimately decided that, okay, we're going to do this and we're going to develop the curriculum, we're going to get it approved, go through the whole process. Did you have a sense of what you wanted the outcome to be? Not necessarily the learning outcomes, but the outcome of people changed by virtue of this experience. Kind of what's your dream with the course? I mean, it's not to sound too, cheesy about it, but what do you hope that students taking your course will get out of this to advance the legal profession, becoming more multiculturally competent, more professional, more civil to each other?
One of my hopes is that every person who graduates from Cooley, actually, whether they take the course or not, but the course is a way to help make this happen, feels that they belong in this profession, that they can actually give rise to their authentic voice, because without it, we're doomed. If people don't start giving their authentic voices to these problems, then they just kind of simmer under the surface and we're never going to solve them. It's what Mable said, listening, but also speaking out so that people can listen. So my major goal is for every student who graduates from Cooley to be able to recognize that they belong in this profession, that they're important to this profession, and that their authentic voice matters for our long-term health of our country.
I can remember in terms of a student saying in class when they came in is, I have never had issues with Blacks or others because I don't see color. Well, the whole idea is we want you to see the differences in people. So my objective with that class is to see as much of that as you can, to embrace it, to basically and to have the opportunity to meet, and not just the racial issue of the class, but we basically have women in terms of the class. We have LGBT, we have everything. We talk about people with disabilities. We talk about various things there. And the idea with that is to allow the students to engage in as much of that as they can, because that's the multicultural lawyering piece that we're looking at.
Really appreciate you taking the time and not only for tonight, but also for, having the wherewithal to say that this was a need that needed to be addressed from a curriculum point of view and adding the class. And I think we all learned a lot and everything that is related that comes from the class. Any final questions or comments from our group here today? Well, great. I want to thank Professors Martin-Scott and O'Leary for their insight and their leadership in this area. Very important. We also want to thank the participants. I think there might be a couple of you here that are contemplating coming to law school, and hopefully you feel even more energized to do that. We want to remind folks that we'll be meeting again next month with a conversation with Professor Tanya Kraus-Phelan and Louis Langham, talking about policing and things related to that. We'll send you a short survey at the end of this just to kind of get your input so that we can continue to improve. And until then, we'll see you. Be kind to one another. Have a good night.
Okay, thank you guys for all coming. We appreciate it. Have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you.